The box had been sitting on the passenger seat for 3 days. Tessa didn't look at it while she drove. She kept her eyes on the road, on the gray stretch of highway that connected her apartment to the part of town she'd never had reason to visit before. The kind of place with hand-painted signs and iron bars on the windows. A place where people brought things they didn't want to let go of but had no other choice. She'd been a nurse for 6 years. ICU, nights mostly, the kind of shift that hollowed you out and filled you back up with something harder and quieter than what you'd had before. She'd worked through a pandemic with the same gloves for 4 hours at a stretch. She'd held a man's hand when his family couldn't get there in time. She'd memorized the sound a ventilator makes when it stops being enough. She hadn't thought any of that would count for nothing. The parking lot of Vance & Sons Pawn was half empty. A hand-lettered sign in the window said, "Cash today, no questions." Tessa sat in her car for a long moment, engine off, listening to the tick of the cooling metal. The box on the seat had a faded ribbon on it, navy blue and gold. She'd tied that ribbon herself, years ago, when she still thought keeping things neat meant they mattered. She picked up the box and got out. It had started 8 months ago, which felt both like yesterday and like something that happened to a different person. She'd been 3 hours into a double shift, charge nurse short-staffed, 2 patients in septic shock, when the call came down from administration. Not a phone call. An actual administrator, in person, which was how you knew it was serious. His name was Grantham. She would never forget that name. He had a hospital lanyard and soft hands, and the particular expression of a man who had already decided what the outcome of the conversation would be. "There's been a complaint," he said. Tessa had still been holding a chart. Against who? Against you. The complaint came from a patient's family. Their mother had deteriorated over 72 hours, and they said Tessa had been inattentive, that she'd missed signs, that she'd documented an assessment she hadn't actually performed. None of it was true. She'd said so, clearly, in the small conference room that smelled like stale coffee and carpet cleaner. She'd walked Grantham through the timestamps, the vitals, the notes she'd written in real time while standing at the bedside. She'd offered to get her coworkers. She'd asked for the specific documentation they believed was falsified. He'd thanked her for her time and told her she was suspended pending investigation. "How long?" she asked. "These things take as long as they take," he said. She drove home that morning with her badge in her pocket and a feeling in her chest like swallowing glass. The investigation took 4 months. During that time, she was not permitted to work at any affiliated hospital. She had savings, enough for 2 months, maybe 3 if she was careful. She stopped buying coffee out. She stopped buying much of anything. She ate what was in the pantry until the pantry got interesting, and then she got creative. Rice and whatever was in the can, eggs stretched 4 different ways. She told herself it was temporary. She applied for jobs at non-affiliated clinics. 2 called her back. Both rescinded interest when they ran her license check and saw the pending investigation flag. Her landlord was a man named Curtis who had always been fair with her. She called him in month 3 and explained the situation. He listened, and then he said he'd give her until the end of the next month, but after that his hands were tied. "I know," she said. "I understand." She wasn't angry at Curtis. She was angry at a system that could put a flag on her name and then just wait, as if her life could be paused while theirs ran on. She'd served in the Army Reserve for 4 years before nursing school. 2 deployments, one to Kuwait and one that took her somewhere she didn't talk about at dinner parties. She'd come home with a commendation she'd been quietly proud of, a combat medic badge, and a way of keeping her face very still when things got hard. People called it composure. Tessa called it learned. None of that was in her hospital file. Month 4, she sold her car. She bought something older and cheaper and used the difference to cover rent. Month 5, she started looking at the box on the closet shelf, the one with the ribbon, the one she'd been moving from apartment to apartment for 6 years without ever opening in front of anyone. Vance & Sons smelled like metal and old carpet and something faintly chemical. The man behind the counter had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the careful, neutral expression of someone who had seen everything and was no longer surprised. His name was printed on a laminated card clipped to the display case. "Hank Fee, help you," he said. Tessa set the box on the glass counter. She didn't open it yet. "I have some medals," she said. "Military. I don't know what they'd go for. I don't know the market." Hank V looked at the box and then at her. His expression didn't change. "Let me see what you've got," he said. She lifted the lid. Inside, a combat medic badge, an Army Commendation Medal with a V device, Valor on a red and white ribbon, a Meritorious Service Medal, and one more, the one that sat separate from the others on a small square of cotton. Bronze star with V device. Hank was quiet for a moment. He picked up the bronze star and turned it over. "These are yours?" "Yes." He looked at her again, differently this time. She'd been so focused on Hank, on keeping her voice level, on not making this any harder than it already was, that she hadn't heard the door. She didn't hear the footsteps either, or if she did, she'd process them as background noise, another customer. Not her problem. What she noticed first was the dog. A Belgian Malinois, compact and dark-coated, with the kind of alert stillness that working dogs carry even when they're at rest. It had come up beside her without a sound, and now it was standing with its head level with the counter, looking at the medals spread on the glass. Then it did something she didn't expect. It stepped forward, put both front paws up on the edge of the counter, carefully, not aggressively, and rested its chin on the glass next to the bronze star, and it just stayed there. It didn't look at Hank. It didn't look at her. It looked at the medals. "Cody." The voice behind her was low, even. "Off." The dog didn't move. Tessa turned. The man standing in the doorway was somewhere in his mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, but carrying himself in a way that made civilian clothes seem like a costume. He had a leash in one hand, loose, and he was looking at his dog with an expression that was somewhere between exasperated and something else she couldn't name. "Cody," he said again. The dog finally lowered its paws, but it didn't back up. It stood next to Tessa and leaned its weight against her leg, and the warmth of it went through her jeans like something she hadn't known she needed. The man walked up to the counter. His eyes moved from the dog to the medals. He went still. "Excuse me," he said, and the question was directed at her. "Is that a bronze star with V? Yes? Yours?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. His name, she would learn later, was Carver. Not his first name. She got the impression he was used to being called by his last name and had stopped noticing the strangeness of it. He was a Navy SEAL, retired 18 months, now working with a nonprofit that ran canine programs for veterans with PTSD. Cody was his. He was also, in this specific moment, the first person in 8 months to look at her medals and look at her like those two things added up to something. "You're selling them," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Tessa didn't look away. "I'm considering it." The silence stretched. Hank had gone quiet behind the counter, holding the bronze star the way people hold things when they've understood they've stumbled into a moment larger than a transaction. "Can I ask why?" Carver said. She almost didn't answer. She was good at not answering, at deflecting with a short response and a closed expression. She'd learned it in the Army and perfected it in the ICU. But the dog was still leaning against her leg, and she was so tired, and somehow the combination of those things made the careful answer she'd been preparing just dissolve. She told him the truth. They sat in the small waiting area near the front of the shop, two plastic chairs angled toward each other. Cody curled at Tessa's feet like he'd known her for years. She talked for a long time. Not the way she'd talked to Grantham, carefully, strategically, with documentation in mind, just the actual story. What had happened and what had come after. Carver listened the way some people listen, completely, without filling the pauses. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The complaint," he said, "did it originate with the family, or were the family coached?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, was the family acting on their own grief and frustration, which is normal and real, or did someone give them a particular direction to take their complaint? Those are different problems." Tessa thought about that. She'd been thinking about the family, about their pain, about what they must have felt watching their mother decline. She hadn't thought about who might have pointed their grief in her specific direction. "There's a doctor," she said slowly. "Weston. He'd been pushing for a change in the patient's protocol. I documented my concerns about the change. We disagreed in the chart, basically, professionally. And when the complaint came through, who handled the internal review?" She opened her mouth, closed it. The department head who'd overseen the investigation was a man named Dr. Pruitt. He and Weston had been on a committee together. She'd known that. She'd noted it at the time and then set it aside because it felt paranoid, because she'd been trying to be fair, because she'd assumed the process would be fair in return. Carver was watching her. "I think I've been very naive," she said. "No," he said. "You trusted a system you thought was designed to be trustworthy. That's not naivety. That's reasonable expectation." She looked at him. "Is there a difference?" "There is. One you can fix." Carver knew people. That was the first thing she understood about him, not in the way everyone claims to know people, as a vague social currency, but in a specific and purposeful way. He had served in places that required a working knowledge of who could be trusted to do what, and he had carried that knowledge into civilian life. The second thing she understood was that he didn't offer help as a performance. He asked what she needed, and when she told him, he nodded and figured out how to get it. What she needed was a lawyer who understood both medical licensing and employment law, someone who could look at her documentation and identify whether what had happened rose to the level of tortious interference with her career. What she also needed, it turned out, was a records request she hadn't thought to make. For the original complaint, the actual written complaint, with the signature and the date. The date mattered. The date on the signed complaint was 3 days before the family had any documented interaction with hospital-patient relations. 3 days before they had made any formal statement of concern. Someone had drafted the complaint before the family filed it. Carver sat across from her at her kitchen table when the lawyer, a woman named Aldridge, walked her through what that meant. Tessa had made coffee, the real kind, the first time in months she'd used the good beans. She wasn't sure why. It had felt important. "This doesn't prove Weston was behind it," Aldridge said. "Not yet. What it proves is that the timeline that was presented to you was false. The complaint was prepared before it should have been possible to prepare it. That's enough to file a grievance with the state medical board against the process itself, and it's enough to demand a stay of the investigation pending an audit." "How long does that take?" Tessa asked. "Weeks, not months, because now you have grounds." Tessa looked at the papers spread across her table. Her whole professional life, reduced to dates and signatures, and the gap between them that meant someone had decided what her fate would be before she'd ever sat down with Grantham. She felt the anger, which had been living in her chest for months in a compressed and careful form, finally take its full shape. It wasn't the loud kind of anger. It was the kind that knows what it's for. The board moved faster than Aldridge had predicted, partly because the evidence was clear, and partly because Tessa, it turned out, was not the first nurse to have filed a concern about Dr. Weston's conduct. There were 2 others, filed in the previous 3 years, that had been reviewed internally and not escalated. The pattern was visible the moment someone decided to look for it. She sat in the hearing room on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 months after she'd been suspended, 2 months after she'd walked into Vance & Sons with a box of medals she hadn't been able to bring herself to sell. The hearing panel was 3 people. A physician who'd never worked at her hospital, a nursing board representative, and an attorney. They had the documentation, they had the timeline, they had the 2 previous complaints, and the statements of 2 nurses who had, when contacted, been willing to speak. Tessa testified for 40 minutes. She kept her voice level throughout. She had learned to do that. She talked about the patient, about the care she'd provided, about the documentation she'd made in real time. She talked about the conversation with Grantham. She talked about the 4 months she'd spent unable to work while a flag sat on her license. She talked about the box of medals. One of the panel members, the nursing board representative, was a woman about 10 years older than Tessa, with the kind of face that had seen a lot of ICUs. During the period of suspension, she said, "How did you manage financially?" "I sold my car," Tessa said. "I used savings. I applied for jobs I wasn't eligible to take. And I went to a pawn shop to see what my military medals were worth." The room was quiet. "Did you sell them?" the representative asked. "No," Tessa said. "I didn't." The outcome came in writing 2 weeks later. The investigation against her was closed. Her license was cleared of all flags and notations. The hospital was directed to reinstate her with back pay for the full period of suspension, an amount that she would later learn totaled just over $19,000. Dr. Weston was placed under separate investigation. She was not privy to those proceedings. She didn't need to be. Grantham sent her an email. It used the word regret 3 times and the word sorry 0 times. She read it once and deleted it. The hospital's HR department sent a formal letter. It was dense and careful, and written in the language of legal protection, and somewhere in the middle of it was a single sentence that amounted to an acknowledgement that the process had failed her. She kept that letter, not because it was satisfying, it wasn't, particularly, but because she had learned the hard way that documentation mattered. She called her landlord Curtis and told him she'd have the missed month's rent to him by Friday. "I knew you would," he said. "I wasn't worried." She laughed, the first real laugh in longer than she could track. "You were a little worried." "I was a little worried," he admitted. "I'm glad it worked out." Carver texted her the day the letter arrived. She hadn't told him it was coming. She wasn't sure how he knew, whether Aldridge had mentioned it, or whether it was just the particular timing instinct of someone who had spent years operating in environments where timing was everything. "Good news?" the text said. She typed back, "Yes." His response came 30 seconds later. "Cody says he knew." She laughed at that, too. She was standing in her kitchen, reinstatement letter in one hand, phone in the other, and she laughed until she had to sit down. Cody had known something. She still wasn't entirely sure what. Dogs trained for military and police work developed a kind of attunement that the handlers called drive, a focus that went beyond training into something more instinctive. A recognition, maybe, of people who had been in the same kinds of places and carried the same kinds of weight. Whatever it was, Cody had walked up to a counter full of medals and put his chin on the glass, and somehow that small, quiet gesture had been the thing that cracked her open enough to tell the truth to a stranger. She thought about that sometimes. How close she'd come. She'd been standing in that shop trying to calculate whether the combat medic badge would get more than the commendation medal, running numbers in her head because she didn't know what else to do, and a dog had walked up beside her and just stayed. That was all. It had just stayed. She went back to the ICU on a Monday in December night shift. Her badge was new, they'd reissued it, but her locker combination was the same and her scrubs still fit. Her coworker, a travel nurse named Lynn, who'd been on her unit for 3 months and didn't know the history, handed her a patient chart at the start of shift and said, "Bed 4 is tricky. Wanted to catch you up. Tell me," Tessa said. She listened to the handoff standing at the nursing station, pen in hand, the familiar low hum of monitors filling the air around her. She asked 2 questions and made a note. Then she clipped the chart to her arm and walked down the hall toward bed 4. The corridor was the same as it had always been. Fluorescent lights, the particular squeak of certain floor tiles, the smell of antiseptic and warmed plastic tubing. She had walked this corridor more times than she could count. She would walk it many more times after this. She pushed through the door of bed 4 and introduced herself, and the patient, a man in his 60s with worried eyes and a daughter sitting in the chair beside him, looked up at her. "I'm Tessa," she said. "I'll be your nurse tonight. Let me look at what's going on with you." She pulled up the chart. She checked the lines. She asked him where the pain was and listened to the answer. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Some things the paperwork could take away for a while. It couldn't take them away forever. Carver brought Cody to visit the ICU family waiting room on a Thursday afternoon about a month later. It was part of the K9 Comfort program the nonprofit ran, therapy visits for families in the middle of the hardest days of their lives. Tessa had arranged the approval through the unit manager, had filled out the volunteer forms, had made sure all the documentation was in place. She was, at this point, deeply committed to documentation. She was on her break when they arrived, sitting in the staff lounge with bad coffee, and she went out to say hello and ended up staying for the whole visit. She watched Cody move through the waiting room. He was calm in there, different from the alert, purposeful stillness he'd had in the pawn shop, softer somehow, reading each person before he approached them, never pushing, always offering. A teenager who'd been sitting with his arms crossed and his headphones in eventually reached down and put one hand on Cody's head, and his face changed in a way that was almost painful to watch. Carver stood near the door with the leash loose in his hand and said nothing. Tessa stood beside him. "He's good at this," she said quietly. "He was good at the other thing too," Carver said. "He adjusts." She nodded. She understood something about adjusting. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yeah, when you came into the pawn shop that day, were you there to sell something too?" He was quiet for a moment. I was there to buy something, he said. I had a veteran in the program, guy named, well, doesn't matter. He'd sold some things he wanted back. I was trying to find them. She looked at him. Did you find them? No, Hank didn't have them. I'm sorry. He found other things, Carver said. Eventually. People usually do. Cody had settled at the feet of an elderly woman in the corner, the kind of deliberate placement that looked like a choice. The woman had her hand in his fur and her eyes closed, and she was breathing in a way that meant she was holding something very hard, and the dog was making it slightly less hard to hold. Tessa watched them. Yeah, she said. I think that's right. She had a box of medals at home, still. Still in the same box with the ribbon she'd tied herself. She'd thought about what to do with them, whether to display them, frame them, put them somewhere they'd be seen. She hadn't decided yet. She was in no hurry. Some decisions were worth getting right.